Charles Burton is a professor of political science at Brock University, and an expert in Canada-China relations. He joins me now via Skype from St. Catharines. Hi, Professor Burton. Nice to see you.
Hi, Vashi.
Is there any doubt in your mind, Professor, that the detainment of these two individuals, Canadian individuals, is linked to the arrest of Huawei's CFO?
No, there's no doubt in my mind because of the way the Chinese has been phrased. It's pretty clear that this is retaliation. So I think that, you know, the Chinese are going to very extreme lengths to try and pressure the Canadian government to the extent they can, because they're very concerned that if Ms. Meng is sent to the United States, that she could be compelled to provide information about the relationship between her company, Huawei, and the U.S. security and intelligence and the Chinese security and intelligence apparatus, which would be damaging to China's overall geopolitical stance, I guess.
Are you surprised at the lengths that they're then going to? You said, extreme lengths. Are you surprised that it's so extreme?
I think so. I mean, and also their use of language has been beyond undiplomatic in terms of slamming our country in relatively official statements, menacing and really very inappropriate in terms of normal diplomatic protocol. I would think that probably the Chinese Foreign Ministry and the Chinese diplomats in Canada are under a lot of pressure from the center of the Chinese Communist Party to get Ms. Meng back to Beijing as soon as possible and to do all that they can to avoid the eventuality of her having to face U.S. justice and be subject to interrogation that could reveal things that go against China's overall strategy for its rise to power in the future years.
Do you think that means that there could be an escalation? I mean, we know that state-associated media are threatening the idea of an escalation retaliation. Do you think that will happen?
Yes, I do. I mean, I think that while the diplomats here in Canada might be reporting back to Beijing that, you know, we have an independent judiciary and there's really no possibility of getting Ms. Meng back before an extradition process is complete, they're under pressure to get her back, and therefore I think that they'll be doing more and more in terms of these kinds of things, you know, arbitrary arrest of Canadians and probably in the trade area as well. I mean, I would say that we know that when Canadians are taken in by the state security ministry, that means that they're being accused of espionage, which means that they will be subject to a 60-day period of very brutal interrogation following methods that are probably not consistent with a Convention Against Torture of the UN, and they won't see any lawyer until that 60-day period is over. And whether we'll get access to them at all, we certainly won't get access to them where they are incarcerated, but whether our embassy will get to see them at all over that period is very much in doubt. So, you know, it's the severity of it and the emotional blow to all of us who know these gentlemen who are in the China field, including our Canadian diplomats who, of course, worked with Mr. Kovrig and are very emotionally affected because they know how bad things are for him right now in Chinese incarceration.
And we know, and this, of course, could be an evolving situation, but from the government, for example, that they have yet to make contact. Does that surprise you at all? You mentioned that there's a long period there that they'd be incarcerated.
Yes. Well, in these security cases, they don't regard it as subject to the normal diplomatic convention because they don't regard it as a proper arrest because it's been done by the security ministry and not by the public security ministry, the police, and normal judicial bodies. So under these sorts of circumstances, typically they don't allow access. The family don't know where they are, what's happened to them. No charge is made, and as I said, they don't get any lawyer, and it's unlikely that they will get contact with the Canadian embassy unless we are given an exemption, and they will be subject to this interrogation based on past experience with other foreigners like Peter Humphreys of Britain or Peter Dallins of Sweden. They will be subject to this very brutal interrogation until they break and give a confession, which will likely be broadcast on the Chinese TV, a confession under duress that, based on the past cases, also, of course, including Kevin Garrett, will be repudiated by the foreign national once they get out of China, but that could be a very long time from now.
Do you think, A, there's anything the Canadian government or Canada can do to prevent what you just described from happening, or B, to prevent an escalation beyond just the detainment and whatever happens to these two individuals?
I don't see us having very much power in this asymmetrical relationship. You know, after the 1989 Tiananmen massacre, we did withdraw our ambassador and bring down our diplomatic representation because we were very displeased with the response we were getting from the Chinese authority to our concerns over this event. Maybe withdrawing Mr. McCallum for a period would send a serious message to the Chinese government, but my feeling is that this matter is well above the normal purview of China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is a relatively weak player in the Chinese system. The State Security Ministry is a much more significant player. And Huawei is clearly, well, I think pretty clearly to me anyway, connected to the state security and People's Liberation Army. And so I don't think that the Foreign Ministry really has much influence over what's going on, and those, unfortunately, are the only people that were able to engage in this regard. So I think there's a lot of miscommunication, misunderstanding, and enormous desperation on the part of the Chinese regime to prevent Ms. Meng from being sent to the United States, where she could, in fact, start to provide information to the U.S. government that would be highly disadvantageous to the current policies of the government of China.
You touched on Mr. Kovrig, but based on what you know about these two individuals, what is it that you think drew the Chinese government to them, or the Chinese authorities, I'm sorry?
Well, you know, they have been active in sensitive areas. In the case of Mr. Svaver, it's a bit puzzling, as he's been engaged in tourist tours to North Korea. And from the Canadian point of view, I think a lot of his activities are probably of concern to us in terms of the sanctions against North Korea, and shouldn't have been as much of concern to the government of the People's Republic, who, as we know, encourages more interaction with North Korea to support their failing economy. So why he's been taken in, I don't know. Apparently Mr. Svaver and Mr. Kovrig have been in touch with each other with regard to matters relating to peace and resolution of conflict in that region. So it may be that the two cases will be related, but the Chinese government so far has indicated that the two are completely separate and that they're being kept in separate facilities and are being separately interrogated. So eventually we'll get the official Chinese line on this, but I don't think it'll be before the 60 days are up.
And what's your advice, I mean, or what's your, from where you sit, how dangerous do you think it is at this point to be a Canadian doing business in China or some kind of foreign diplomat? There are obviously there's a lot of speculation. Should you be traveling? Should we not? The government is said to be reviewing that. What's your take on it?
I think our diplomats are not in danger because they have the protection of a diplomatic passport. So the worst that could happen to them would be persona non grata expulsion from China, which may happen. You know, they might decide to expel some of our people. With regard to other people, I'd say anybody working in the high-tech area in China or negotiating in that area would be under some degree of threat, and people working in NGOs trying to engage Chinese minority peoples like the Uyghurs and the Tibetans, you know, it also could be sent to the State Security Ministry on the same sorts of charges, false charges of espionage. So, and I imagine a lot of Canadian delegations will decide that this is not a good time to go to China. And I would also expect a lot of Chinese delegations will not be coming here, particularly people who have a similar sort of status to Ms. Meng, who might feel that they could in fact also be subject to some extradition process if they've been engaged in activities that violate U.S. law. So, you know, the whole thing is leading us to a situation where the only issue dominating Canada-China relations seems to be the Meng extradition case, and everything else seems to be subsumed by it, and certainly we won't be doing anything with loosening up our trade relations with China anytime soon.
All right, thank you, Professor Burton. Appreciate your insight.
Good to speak with you.